Good evening, everybody. As chair of the PCN trustees, I'm delighted to welcome so many of you from across the UK and indeed from many other countries to this PCN webinar with Brian McLaren. PCN Britain is part of a growing movement of people across all continents who seek to share a credible Christian faith fit for this third millennium. Opening our minds to the insights of biblical scholarship and opening our hearts to the experiences of love and compassion, we seek to promote an honest understanding of the life of Jesus, and we long to be infused with that same spirit in order to be guided by his teachings and example. Progressive Christians long for churches and all places of worship to be centres of radical inclusivity, places of hospitality, beacons of hope, where opportunities for discussion, debate, faith and doubt can be shared honestly, where folk are unafraid to ask those difficult questions of faith. At PCN, we wish to learn from the insights of all faiths and to dialogue with those of no religious faith, but who seek the common good for humankind. Over the years, PCN Britain has benefited from the wisdom and the inspiration of many writers, theologians and pastors. We're thankful to Richard Holloway, Marcus Borg, Dominic Crossan, Greta Vosper, Jack Spong, Diana Butler-Bass, and many others who have spoken at our conferences and have been and continue to be influencers on this journey of progressive Christianity. One such person, of course, is Brian McLaren, whom we welcomed to the UK back in 2016 for a tour which then attracted hundreds of people of all ages and backgrounds interested in what Brian had to say. And this evening, we're privileged that Brian has given his time as he shares with us thoughts which arise from his latest book, Faith After Doubt. Many of you, like Brian, might have been brought up to believe in a God who demands firm, unwavering faith, and that to question beliefs and dogmas might throw open the terrifying possibility that God might punish and reject you. Early on in this book, Brian says that if you think that is scary to fall into the hands of that kind of angry God, it can be equally scary to be a doubter falling into the hands of angry believers. Well, tonight I hope and trust that we are together in this webinar, not as a group of angry believers, but searchers after meaning and after truth. PCN tries to offer that kind of network of friendships, and I do hope if you're not already a member of PCN Britain, you will be encouraged to find out more about us and support our work through your membership. So thank you for joining us tonight. My thanks especially to my colleagues at PCN who have made this evening possible, and thanks above all to Brian McLaren, our guest this evening.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, there's over 250 people listening tonight, so thank you everyone for attending, and a big welcome to our evening with Brian McLaren, where he's given us a talk on his book, Faith After Doubt, Why Your Beliefs Stop Working and What to Do About It. Now, I was thinking this afternoon about what I could say. Usually, someone in my position who's doing a welcome to a lecture would say something like, please turn all mobile phones off and no talking in the audience. I'd also direct you to the nearest toilets and the fire escapes. Well, tonight, as a special concession, I'm sure Brian won't mind if you leave your mobile phones on. You can also talk as well, and I really haven't got a clue where your toilets and fire escapes are. You're on your own on that side there. The programme for tonight is quite informal, and we'll hopefully cover the following. We'll have a short, fun interview with Brian, where I promise I won't ask you, Brian, about any questions about the book. I'll leave that to others later on in the evening. Brian will then give his talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then it's over to question and response. As Adrian said earlier, we do require sort of membership to help with doing events like this and also being a voice within the Christian church. So if you can go to our website, pcnbritain.org.uk, membership's only £30 for a year, and there's even discounts on that price as well. And we'd very much like to welcome you as members. Well, enough of me. Let's start with our interview. Brian, it's cold, dark and wet here in Harrogate, North Yorkshire. What's it like with you in Florida?
Well, I shouldn't tell you, it'll just make everyone jealous or angry or something. But today it was about 80 degrees. So what would that be? 28 degrees or something Celsius, and sunny and beautiful. And it's just embarrassing where I live in Florida. We were talking before, the big downside of where I live is that 2.5 hours away, our former president lives. So, but the weather is still beautiful.
Talking about your former president, I think in 2016, when you were last with us, you were rather worried about Trump becoming president. Well, he's been and gone. How is America post-Trump, and how are you recovering?
Well, first of all, I'm just remembering all those miles that we drove together to all the different places we visited. We had a great pilgrimage together, and I do remember that sort of feeling of dread that I had. There was something going on, and so for a whole lot of folks like me in the U.S., actually more than 50% of the voters in the U.S., we woke up that next morning with a feeling of dread. And I don't think we've felt that we could breathe free. Even after the election, many of us we saw that something was still going to happen, and January 6th, I'm sure you all watched, as we did, with horror, as what happened here. And I think a lot of us still feel that there's just a lot of toxicity in the system, and it's been pumped there over many years, and it's going to take a long time and hard work to sort of detoxify our social system. But today's a great day to ask that question, because you all maybe heard we've just passed what's probably the most progressive legislation that's been passed in 30 or 40 years, just passed this week and was finally signed today. So it's a day where we feel very much that we're hanging in the balance. Things could get much better, things could get worse. And I think probably many of you all would have a similar feeling, and probably many people in different places around the world would have a similar feeling. Yeah, dynamic times.
Great stuff. Yes, it's just brought back to me our trip around the UK in my wife's Zafira car, filled with boxes of your books, where we discussed all sorts of theology, God, Christianity, and then we got onto the important things like football and the historical influence of Blackadder and things like this. So we had a great time, didn't we? We did.
That's right, we did.
Right, next question. I recently saw a Star Trek film with my daughter where Spock came face to face with his older self. If there was a break in the time continuum and somehow or other you came in contact with yourself aged 20, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self? And more importantly, what do you think he would think of you now?
Well, the first advice I'd give him would be, really enjoy your hair while you have it. You have no idea what's coming. But my 20-year-old self, so I was second year of university, and I think spiritually, in terms of advice I would give myself, I'll talk a little bit more about that, when I'm talking about the book, but I think I would have told myself two primary things. I would have told myself, don't be intimidated by the religious leaders who are always threatening you and, just holding, judgment and condemnation over you. I think at 20, I was still paying them a lot more heed than I think I should have. So that would have been the first thing I would have told them. And then probably the second thing I would have told them is that you're either going to spend your whole life stuck in a box or shrinking your box, or you're going to spend your whole life breaking out of your box and letting your frame of reference get bigger. And I would have, given myself that challenge to be comfortable with the idea that life is about expanding our frame of reference.
What's the best and the worst aspects of being an author of Christian books?
Well, I suppose for me, the best is that I actually love to write. I love constructing sentences. I love it when paragraphs come together. I love editing. I love fixing things over a long period of time. So, and I love just the creative process where you start with a question or a problem, and then you just explore and see what is invented and what comes to light. So, I mean, that's just something I love. It's a artistic endeavor, a creative endeavor. And then obviously you have this hope that you're helping some people. So, and when a book comes out and people contact you and tell you that it's helped them, that's incredibly rewarding. So, so that would certainly be, there are many, many best things. The worst thing isn't even that bad anymore. But when I first started writing, I was I was just over 40. And, when you put your ideas out there, suddenly you find out that there are a whole lot of people who their job is to find out everything that's wrong, in their opinion, with what you've said. And so you lose some anonymity, and you are certain to get some enemies and critics. And, that, especially at the beginning, that was intimidating and caused me some anxiety. I have to say, now that I'm older, you kind of get a thicker skin, and you also just grow as a human being, where you learn to separate your ego from from your work, and you learn to say, well, if anyone who tries to do something creative and authentic, there's going to be people who don't appreciate it. So you get used to that after a while.
Okay. What do you consider to be your best book that you've written? I'm sure it'll probably be your latest book, because it'll be like a little baby one, I imagine. But have you got a book that you look back on and think, oh, I'm really pleased I wrote that book?
Well, I feel that way about, you've got it exactly. Whatever is your most recent book is the one that you feel, you feel a little bit like your kindergarten child or your small child sending off to school for the first time. You have a special protection and affection for that. One of the early books I wrote was called The Story We Find Ourselves In, and writing that book had the act of writing that book had a big effect on my own kind of theological evolution. And then I wrote a book a few years later called Everything Must Change. And probably of all the books, that's the one that had the biggest effect on me, just in the way I live from day to day. So those would be two that really stand out. But this book, Faith After Doubt, and then the book that comes out next, I'm just finishing the first draft. It will come out sometime in 2022, and it's called Do I Stay Christian? And I feel they're two of the most important books I've written, and they've been so far just a pleasure to write.
Brilliant. Okay. I'm sure there's prospective people who are listening to you tonight who are sort of thinking about, maybe I should write a book, about theology. I've got a big beef about this within the church. Maybe I should write about it. What advice could you give somebody in that situation as to what they ought to do?
Yeah, well, we're at such a different place now than when I started writing. My first book came out in 1998, and I started writing it in 1995. And the truth is, now anybody who's watching this has an internet connection. And now anyone with an internet connection can do instant global publishing, whether it's on Facebook or a blog or whatever. And so the world is just different. If I were starting over again, I'm not sure, I might decide to work differently than going through traditional publishers, just because it's all changing so fast. Although I'm a lover of the actual physical artifact of a book, and I'm deeply grateful for publishers. But the thing I'd say to somebody who's just thinking about starting now is, I'd say, take advantage of the platform that's at hand, and that is, start a blog. Make sure you put interesting things on your Facebook page. If there are people who develop huge followings for their thoughts through Twitter, 140 characters at a time. So I would encourage someone to start building a platform now, start getting your message out now, and start building a following now. Because here's the thing, I can tell anybody, if you do decide you want to write a book through traditional publishing, I can just about guarantee that within the first 5 minutes that you talk to either an agent or a publisher, they'll ask, how big is your platform? Meaning, how many people are following you on social media and so on. So, but the fact is, everyone now can publish something that can be read by anyone in the world with an internet connection. That's a pretty amazing thing.
It is, it is. So when you're not writing, when you're not giving talks like this, and when you're not touring the world, etc., how do you relax? What do you do?
Well, I love the outdoors, Paul. So and I live. In fact, the reason I moved to Southwest Florida is I live right at the edge of the Everglades and right at the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm a kayaker, and I love to be out of my kayak. I love to fish, and I love birds and wildlife. So to be out and take a hike and enjoy the beauty of creation is super refreshing to me. As you can see behind me, I'm also a musician. I love music. So those are two of my great loves.
Okay, no, good. I think when we've spoken beforehand, you said you enjoy films as well. What's your favorite film and why?
So, whenever anybody asks me that, I have to say, well, which category? Because I have favorites in different categories. So let me give you two. Um, the movie that I've probably watched more times than any other, a whole lot of people, you're about to totally lose respect for me. But I love stupid movies. I'm always I'm serious. I'm writing. I just love stupid movies. So um, Weird Al Yankovic's movie, UHF, is my favorite stupid movie. And then for more serious movies, there are so many great ones. But The Color Purple is a movie I keep going back to and watching again and again. I think partly because I think for me as a white-skinned person, um, it's always so good for and important for white people to enjoy art that helps us see the world through other people's eyes, and in some ways learn history uh, that many of us aren't so familiar with. But then the other thing about that movie is it's a movie that really is a story of, it's a sort of reverse prodigal son, where in some ways it's the elders who are lost, and an honest young woman helps many people kind of find their way back home.
Oh, fantastic. Good. Almost it. Quick fire now, Brian. Just some things about films. James Bond or Jason Bourne? What's your favorite?
Oh gosh, James Bourne, I guess. Yeah.
Star Wars or Star Trek?
Star Trek.
Star Trek. Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter?
Lord of the Rings.
Okay. Right, that's it from me. I think over to you, Brian. People would much more like to listen to you than me. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. And what a pleasure to be chatting with you again, remembering our round the country trip just over 4 years ago. First of all, everyone, thanks so much for being part of this. I thought a way that I could introduce one of the key ideas of Faith After Doubt would be to integrate a model that I give in the book with my own experience. So that's what I'd like to do in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. In the book, I talk about a model of faith development, where I offer 4 stages of faith development. And whenever I try to tell people about this, I say first, we all should be careful of anyone who offers a model of faith or any kind of model of human development if there are multiple stages and they like to put themselves in the top stage, right? Because I think there are ways these can be used to oppress people, to humiliate people, or to elevate people. So I'm aware of all those dangers in talking about stages of faith, but I'm also aware that stage theories can really be helpful to people. I think about, for example, my wife and I now have 5 grandchildren, but when we had our own children, when our first baby was coming, we went to the hospital and had a series of lectures to prepare, and we went to classes to prepare for childbirth. And I remember the nurse talked about the first trimester, the second trimester, the third trimester, and each time she would tell us what we should expect in each stage. And then when we got close to delivery, she told us about the different stages of delivery. There was the early labor, and then there was something called the transition, and then there was the active childbirth. And my goodness, I look back and think, for both my wife and me, having some sense when something happens to say, oh yeah, we were told to expect this. This is normal. We don't have to be afraid. That can make all the difference. Some years ago, I was on a plane. I was going to some small town in Canada, and I was on a little plane, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 passenger plane. And there were just 2 seats next to each other. And the fellow sitting next to me was a young adult with special needs. And he sat down and he was very anxious, and he looked over at me and he said, have you ever gotten on one of these things before? And I said, yeah, I fly a lot. He says, this is my first time in an airplane and I'm really, really nervous. And so I remember I said to him, well, listen, let me tell you what it's like. And I said, we're going to go really fast. And then you won't even know when we get off the ground and go up in the air. And I said, and then you're going to hear a loud bang. And his eyes got big. And I said, but don't be worried. That's normal. That's just the wheels being lifted up into the plane. So that's normal. And I told him, that we might have turbulence, but don't worry. It's kind of fun. And so I tried to help him calm down. And I'll never forget, after we took off and the bang happened of the retraction of the landing gear, he looked at me and he said, this is okay, right? And I said, yes. And I just think helping people know what to expect can really make a difference. So 4 stages. And the first stage I call simplicity. I grew up in a very conservative Christian background. And here's the thing, when you grow up in a conservative Christian background, you don't know it. This is your only life. You have nothing to compare it to. If you grow up Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu or atheist, however you grow up is normal. And the view of the world that your parents and the other trusted adults in your world bring to you, it's the world that you accept, and it's the terms that you accept the world. You have no choice. You have nothing to compare it to. And so we might call simplicity the age where we trust the authority figures and we trust what they tell us. You might say that stage 1, simplicity, is faith before doubt. And our job in simplicity is to learn all the information that the authority figures are giving us. And most of that information is given to us in binaries. So I call this the stage of dualism. Is this safe or dangerous? Is this right or wrong? Are these people friends or enemies? Are these good guys or bad guys? Is this poison or safe? So we all of life is set up in these binaries. And it's very important for us to learn those binaries so that we don't run out in the street to play and suddenly a car comes. So it's a matter of life and death. And we trust what our authority figures tell us by and large, but even children learn how to say no. Even children sometimes think their parents hate them when they won't do for them what they wish. So there's a kind of doubt that happens in stage 1, but it's within this framework of security where the rules of the game are clear. Trust your authority figures. And I was very fortunate. My parents could not have been more loving people and more gracious parents. And, they were in this very rigid expression of Christianity, but they were the most loving, expansive people in that tradition. But I remember my first real encounter with doubt. I was probably 13 or 14 years old, and it had been building over some time because I loved, as I said to Paul earlier, I loved wildlife. I loved trees and plants, and I loved snakes and frogs, and I loved birds. And so I would go to the library and check out every book I could on the natural world. And so by the time I was 8 or 9 years old, I was reading about evolution because I was interested in dinosaurs. And so by the time I was 13 or 14, it was just clear in my mind, evolution made so much sense. And I remember hearing sermons in my church about how evil Charles Darwin was and how evil the theory of evolution was. And then I remember a Sunday school class where I must have raised my hand and asked the teacher, maybe he was reading to us the Genesis story, and I might have just raised my hand and said, what about evolution? I don't remember what I asked, but I do remember this Sunday school teacher saying, well, you have to make a choice. You either believe in God or evolution. And at that moment, I remember, and I just can remember the look of the room, the classroom. There was a couch in one end. I was sitting on the couch. I can just picture it because it seemed to be almost a formative moment in my life. And I remember thinking a couple things. First thought was, I know my church isn't okay with evolution, but I know I am. So I gave myself this little permission for something to be okay with me that wasn't okay with our church. And I also remember thinking, and I bet God is okay with evolution too. um, and in that way, in my mind, I was starting to compartmentalize things. Here's what my church thinks. Maybe God is a little different than my church, and here's where I am, and I'm making decisions for myself. The other thing I remember going through my mind is I'm, 14 years old, and in 4 more years, I'm out of here. I just remember thinking, this isn't going to be a good place for someone like me. If they tell me that something that makes sense to me, I'm not allowed to take seriously. And so that was the beginning of my discomfort with stage one simplicity. But I need to say, there are many people who stay in stage one simplicity their whole lives. And there could be any number of reasons for this. One could be they didn't have the kind of parents I had. They have people who are just constantly saying, constantly threatening them. They may live in a totalitarian regime. They may live in a culture where there are no options. You have to think the way the group thinks, or you will be, threatened and punished. And a lot of people through a lot of history, that's the kind of environment that they have lived in. But I think other people also, they are young, they obey their parents, and they become parents, and they want their children to obey them. So they tell their children what they were taught, and they make it through life. And stage one keeps working for them all the way through. But for me and for an awful lot of people, you get out of stage one. If we call stage one faith before doubt, stage two I call complexity, and we could say stage two is faith managing doubt. And I know from even my high school years, I was a good student. I loved to read. I actually read philosophy when I was in high school. And so I started encountering all these questions and issues and challenges to things that I'd been taught by the trusted authority figures in my stage one experience. And so in complexity, you start trying to negotiate. Maybe I can unscrew that old belief about evolution, and I could put in theistic evolution, put in a module from creationism now to theistic evolution. Or maybe you grow up with a certain kind of eschatology or the view of the end times, and you think, boy, that doesn't make sense. And so you unscrew that and screw something else in. But basically, you're trying to fix your faith to make it livable. I call stage two the stage of pragmatism. You're trying to make things work. You might say, well, the version of Christianity that I inherited from my parents wasn't perfect. So I want to tweak this and tweak this and tweak this, hoping I can make it perfect, and or at least make it livable. And stage two took me a long way. Of course, I didn't have this language back then, but a memory came back to me not long ago of a time I went to this older fellow in my church who was a youth group leader. And I can't even remember what the issue was. It might have been an issue some of you have heard about. And if you don't know what this means, just consider yourself very blessed. But it might have been free will versus predestination or something like that. So I go and I ask him, which is right? And here's what I remember him saying. There are 4 different ways to look at that. And good Christians hold all 4. Let me explain them to you. And he goes through these 4 views. And then he says, I'm really comfortable with these 2, somewhat comfortable with this one, not really that comfortable, but a lot of Christians are. And he gave me this 4 options. And my mind was blown, because all authority figures in my life had told me, this is right, that's wrong. This is right, everything else is wrong. And now he's giving me 4 viable options. That's the world of complexity. And I loved stage 2. I loved complexity. The way I see stages, it's not like you're in one stage and then you leave it behind and now you're in another stage and then you get rid of that. I look at stages like rings on a tree. And your first stage, there are things you're learning that you're going to need for the rest of your life. But then you grow beyond to start learning some new things. A new ring emerges on the tree. And then you grow beyond that. And each new ring includes the earlier ones, but expands upon them. And so stage 2 worked really well for me. And until I was in my early 20s. And I had a series of personal experiences that just went terribly. And I won't go into the details now for the sake of time. But I had been reading all these Bible verses and I'd memorized them, that if you do this and if you believe that and if you pray like this, your life will go well. And I've got to admit, I was about as zealous and rigorous and committed as anybody I'd ever met. And I had a series of things just go as badly as they could possibly go. And I remember thinking, all those easy steps to success that I trusted, all those promises I claimed, they just didn't work. And that was my first entree into stage 3, what I would call perplexity. And in perplexity, if stage 1 is faith before doubt and stage 2 is faith managing doubt, stage 3 is faith in doubt. And I remember over a period of years, especially it hit me hard in graduate school. I was a literature major and we were studying literary theory and we were studying how texts have meaning and how communities give text meaning and how there are communities of interpretation. And so much of what I was learning in my literary classes helped me see what was going on in my religious world. And I just, it was the deepest, the entree into the deepest period of doubt that I had ever faced. Right around that same time, interestingly, I was part of a little new church that developed, and I ended up becoming the pastor of that church. For a while, I was a part-time college English teacher and part-time pastor, and eventually became a full-time pastor. And so suddenly I'm in the position where I'm supposed to be leading something. Part of my brain is in stage 3. Part of me is back in stage 2, and I'm trying to make it work, and I'm trying to work these things out. And I spent quite a few years in that sort of juncture, jumping back and forth between stage 2 and stage 3. Maybe in private, I was in stage 3 in perplexity. And in public, I was trying to make stage 2 work. So much I could say about that. But during those years, every once in a while, I would meet someone. Well, I should first say, I hardly knew a single person who was asking the kind of questions I was asking. Anyone who'd asked those questions had just left the Christian faith and left religion. And I could do that, although at that point it would have involved changing my career. But there was something that was still holding me in my faith. And yet I was so frustrated with just about every dimension of the Christian faith. And, but every once in a while I'd meet someone who I thought, this person has asked all the questions I've asked and they found something. There's something there. And I was getting just a little sense of what in this book I call stage 4 or harmony, about a bigger view that says that instead of saying stage 1 people are fools and idiots and simpletons, leave them behind, or stage 2 people are pragmatists and con artists, leave them behind. It says, no, stage 1 people are doing the best they can. That's where they are. And stage 2 people, they're doing what's theirs to do. They're doing the best they can with what they have. And maybe they'll eventually come stage 3 people who are also doing what's theirs to do. They're questioning things. They're asking deep, deep questions about justice and injustice. They're asking questions about epistemology. How do we know? What do we mean when we say no? They're trying to learn how they can live with a mix of knowing and unknowing, with a willingness to say that whatever I currently know, I may later find out isn't totally true. Am I humble enough to admit that when that happens? And that's the work of stage 3. And I began to see there are certain people who have a bigger vision. And little by little, I started coming across some of those people. And even though I wasn't using this kind of language at that time, I was starting to be able to put the pieces together and see there is some bigger and more expansive way to hold Christian faith. I'm going to guess that what I was finding is exactly what the people found who started Progressive Christian Network, and it's what has attracted many of you to this community. My understanding is that stages are iterative. So when you get to that 4th stage, it doesn't mean that you've arrived and you'll be there forever now. What it means is that tends to become your new simplicity. You get comfortable with it. It helps you deal with the world. And then guess what? Some new complexity is going to hit, and you'll deal with that. And then some new perplexity is going to hit. And my sense is that we go through these things. You might think of it like winter, spring, summer, and fall make up 1 year. And then you do winter, spring, summer, and fall. But when you do those 4 seasons, the next time you're a different person. You've grown. And my guess is that after we go through these things enough, we start to realize that simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony are more like 4 competencies that human beings have. And we become more and more comfortable with working with all of those competencies. And that helps us be whole and mature people. I was very fortunate when I was a pastor that eventually I started telling people, I started admitting that I was in stage 3, that I was having questions. And I'll never forget a fellow in my church who was a member of our leadership team came up to me. We were going to have a leadership retreat. And a few days before the retreat, he said, Brian, there's something I really wanted to put on the agenda for our retreat. I said, what's that? He said, these questions you're asking and this journey you're on to think things through and maybe think differently. He said, we've got to decide if this is your journey or if it's our journey too. And I said to him, please, let's not talk about that. We have a really full agenda. And I have to admit, I was afraid. I thought that a lot of people in our leadership team would have said, this is Brian's problem. We're all fine with our faith the way it is. And that this could have caused, some big rift or big problem that maybe we would have to deal with. I just didn't want to deal with it that weekend. And so I asked him not to do it, but at the retreat, guess what? He did it. In one of our discussion sessions, he raised his hand. He said, I've got something I really need us to talk about. And so he just said, is this Brian's journey or is it our journey too? And what I almost get tears in my eyes when I say this, but I remember that discussion when around the room, people said, no, we're all on this journey. We want to be able to ask questions. We want to have freedom to rethink what it means to be a Christian, rethink how we understand the Bible, rethink, everything. We want to be on this journey too. And it didn't mean everything was easy after that, but it meant that from that point on, I had more of a sense that I was not alone and that I didn't have to hide. And that maybe as I worked out my own struggles, I would be helping other people work out their struggles as well. And it's kind of an emotional week for me because the co-founder of that church, who was my partner in starting the church and one of the dear friends of my life, 3 weeks ago got COVID and just passed away last Friday. And so I'm just, and we, on Sunday, there was a kind of impromptu memorial service on Zoom. And as I saw, I left the church 16 years ago and moved to a different state. But as I was with people, a few familiar faces, but many faces that I'd never seen before, obviously. And I realized that that same spirit was there and that this congregation had become what I call in the book, a community of harmony. Not a community that says we're only for stage 4 people and we'll kick everybody else out. No, a community that says we'll accept you at stage 1 and then we want to help you to grow. And then we'll accept you at stage 2 and there are things you want to learn and we want to help you learn those things. And then we want to help you grow. In the sense that all of us are on a lifelong journey and that Christian faith is not a destination. It is a way. It is a path. a lifelong path. And it was, my wife and I were both deeply moved being part of that memorial service, realizing that that congregation has continued to be a community of harmony, largely because of the great example of my friend who has stayed there, and he and his wife have, continued to be kind of the elder statespeople of the elder saints, really, of the community. So that's a good place for me to stop, and we'll have some time now. Some people have some questions. They might have a passage from the book that they would like to make a comment on or ask a question about, or something related. And so I'll turn it over to the team now.
With a question from Joe Davis. So Joe, if you can start your video or at least unmute, would you like to ask your question, please?
Hi, Brian. Great to see you again. And
great to see you, Joe.
The book is just wonderful. Love it. You said on page 173, are you a believer who puts your distinct beliefs first, or are you a person of faith who puts love first? Well, Rachel and I tried to be the latter, but as our theology morphed in that journey and we started to see the need for the church to accept and even repent of our attitudes to same-sex couples, I was, encouraged to leave the church that I love dearly, that we moved here to be an associate pastor and everything. So my question is, do you think we can find a home in institutional churches if our beliefs vary from the norm, or do we have to create new communities? Of course, if we have to create new communities, how do we stop making the same old mistakes?
Yes.
How do we just stop that circle going on? So two questions there, really.
Well, Joe, thanks very much. And by the way, I just want to say how much I like your hairstyle.
Thank you. I like yours.
So Joe, it's interesting. I was on a group last night doing a session, something like this. And one woman just said, she told the story how they had started something new. And she said it was the most wonderful experience of faith and fellowship. And she said, then a bunch of stage one people came in and ruined the whole thing. And she said, and she asked a really interesting question. How would a group protect itself from from being taken over by those, sort of stage one thinkers? So the reason I bring up that story is that starting something new, I think that's one of the options that we have, but doing it is going to be tricky, and it's going to require a new set of skills. One of those skills, I'm quite certain, is the skill of when people get together, having sort of this sense in their mind, we are not for everybody. To be able to say, we're here for people who want to be on a lifelong journey of faith. If you're looking for a community where everybody agrees on all their conclusions when they start, listen, we can recommend this church down the road and that church across town. There are so many churches that can help you. That's not what we're about. And we're not for everybody. Now that might sound not inclusive, but it's inclusive in a way that's sustainable, I think. An analogy I make sometimes is to say hospitals are totally inclusive of sick people, but they're not totally inclusive about who gets to join the staff. You really have to be a doctor or a nurse in order to treat people. And so there's this sense that we want to help everybody understand why we're here. And your question, so I think the starting new kinds of communities is one option. I should just say later today for me, and it'll be very late in the evening for you, there's a wonderful musician here in the US named Ken Miedema, one of the most creative human beings I've ever met. Well, when COVID hit, Ken couldn't do concerts anymore. So he started doing a Thursday night online concert. And he has something like 3,000 people. Let's see, I wrote it down. How many? Yeah, he has almost 4,000 people every Thursday night listening to his weekly online concert. And what's happened is he's got all these people who are telling him, this is church for us now. And the fact that he was an artist and that he wasn't starting by saying, I have to start a church. He was saying, I want to create a meaningful experience for people, and music will be part of it, and poetry will be part of it, and storytelling will be part of it. And people are saying, this is the best thing I've ever been part of. So, that's starting new things is important. But I also think that there are many, many congregations that are in the process of retooling. But here's the problem. Almost every existing congregation, when it tries to be reborn, if I can use that word, into what I'm calling a 4-stage faith community, where there's room for people at all these different stages. Their first question is, what's the least I need to change in order to get where I need to be? And so the idea is they're very stingy with how they want to keep as much the same as they can and change as little as possible. I think what those existing congregations are going to find over time is that doesn't work. And that actually we're in great danger of carrying along too much with us. But what we've got to do is center down on the greatest treasures of our faith and really make them central. And that's why, from reading the book, there's a little verse in the book of Galatians that as I was, these last few years, I've just seen, this is one of the most radical statements in the entire Bible, where Paul says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. Now, circumcision was a boundary marker. So he's saying none of the boundary markers that we're obsessed with mean anything. The only thing that matters is faith expressing itself in love. And so for our existing institutional churches to go through that kind of change, I think it will happen. I think it is happening. But I think it involves saying, what does it mean for us to become a school of love in this world today, in the way of Jesus, which, by the way, I think in the spirit of Jesus, it doesn't mean you reject truth from anybody else. I think in the spirit of Jesus, you rejoice in whatever truth, all the truths that the Buddha taught, and you rejoice in the truths that people of other faiths have and bring. That's not in spite of your being a follower of Jesus. It's because you're a follower of Jesus. So I think that that's possible, but I think we're in a really messy patch right now. Mm-hmm. And people are finding ways to survive and make things work, whether it's a concert or, frankly, I'll bet for a whole lot of people, PCN becomes one way that they maintain their sanity and find some form of community in the middle of this liminal time. So I don't think that's a super satisfying answer, Joe, but it's maybe the best I've got.
Thanks, Brian. Brilliant. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we move on to Simon Nixon, who has a question. Are you there, Simon? You'll need to unmute.
The passage that I wanted to share was from page 243. It goes, and then it takes a different kind of work, more like a labor of giving birth, to bring a new consciousness into the world, a consciousness that is able to hold our dualism in a bigger harmony, a harmony that doesn't dissolve differences, but rather holds it in an expansive, universal, unitive love. Many of us have a name for this vital inner labor, contemplation. And so the context for my question is, during my own kind of stage 2's complexity, I felt I was able to grow and develop through personal Bible study and prayer. And I was really disciplined at the time, which was kind of encouraged by my church tradition. And it was really beneficial for me at that point. But then going through a period of significant perplexity and moving closer towards harmony, I found those practices that served me really well at the time no longer feed me in the same way that they do now. And so after trying to leaving the guilt of losing those disciplines I had a little bit of pride in at the time, like my diet now is much more ad hoc. It's reading works like yours and podcasts and a bit of journaling. But what I'd really appreciate is that any suggestions or advice into actively moving towards the consciousness that you describe, that holds that experience of expansive, universal, unitive love.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, Simon, the way you express that, you know, I just know you're going to be okay, because you have the right attitude. You know, in Buddhism, they use the term the beginner's mind, which is a mind that's open to being taught and is even doesn't have demands or expectations of how one is going to learn. One is so hungry for truth that a person is ready to receive truth in a variety of different ways. So I can just feel that in your question. What is happening for a lot of people over the last 20 years is they're looking to new models of Christian faith. Maybe I could say it like this. For those of us who grew up in especially white Western Christianity, and of course, a lot of people of color, they've been inducted into a kind of white Western Christianity. In fact, I hate to say it, but I think it's true. A lot of what we call Christian orthodoxy is really an ethnic version of Christianity. It's a European-based, you know, a lot of German theology and a lot of Italian theology and a lot of British theology. If you're Catholic, it's a little more Italian. If you're Lutheran, it's a little more German. If you're Anglican or evangelical, it's a little more British. But we don't realize that what we call orthodoxy is very often just kind of ethnic. There's an ethnic dimension to it. Nothing wrong with that, but it's just too bad that we get this assumption that that's the only legitimate form. And so what starts to happen is when people in some of those forms start to say, my form isn't working, they start looking for insight in other expressions. Now, we could talk in a minute, and people also sometimes say, well, let me look in other religions and see if they have anything that will help me. But just even within Christianity. So I remember this happened to me. I was probably in my 30s. I had zero curiosity about Eastern Orthodoxy. All I knew about it was that they had a lot of gold and a lot of big, you know, big costume and rituals and all the rest. But I remember meeting a Greek Orthodox Christian who told me that whenever he heard evangelicals like me talk about Christianity, he didn't even recognize it as Christianity. He said, you're so obsessed with sin. And I remember thinking, what else is there? This is what this is about. This is about solving our sin problem. He said, as a Greek Orthodox, I never, ever, ever think about that. And I said, well, what do you think about? He said, I think about being whole and healthy. Remember, Jesus did all that healing. The message is for us becoming whole. So I don't look at people and think about how sinful and depraved they are. I think about how sick and wounded they are. And I wonder how the Spirit of God can heal them. And I just remember at that moment thinking, I want to learn more about Eastern Orthodoxy, you know? And so I crossed that boundary and found out some great treasures there. In the last probably the last 30 years now, there's been a huge resurgence of interest in Celtic Christianity, because in some ways it was an indigenous expression of Christianity before imperial thinking of the Roman Empire reconquered, that part of the world where you live. And so Celtic Christianity offered another help for people. I'll tell you a huge one for me is when I stumbled into liberation theology and Black theology, because what I realized there, I was introduced to new ways of looking at the Bible and seeing the whole biblical narrative. And then one other dimension of this that's been helping many, many people is a rediscovery of the Christian mystics and the Christian contemplative tradition. And there are amazing resources that are at people's fingertips now that were not available to people even 20 years ago. I remember being a pastor and I wanted to learn more about mysticism. I had 0 books on mysticism on my own shelf because evangelicals were against mysticism. And so I went to the public library and I checked out a book I still remember called Protestant Mystics. And then I checked out another book that was called The Warriors of God, which was not about warriors. It was about the founders of the Catholic orders and their mystical experiences. And what I realized was there was this whole stream of Christian faith, going back to the early Desert Fathers and Mothers, that were not focused on arguments about doctrine. They were really focused on experience, and they were really focused on a way of life. And I just felt like that's okay. If I'm going to call myself a Christian, that stuff is mine too. And so I would say, Simon, that would be this wonderful sort of learning experience that could be out ahead of you. And people like my dear friend and colleague Richard Rohr are doing a lot to help people discover practices of the contemplative tradition that might help you as much now as prayer and Bible study helped you when you were just entering stage 2. And they don't leave prayer and Bible study behind. They'll envelop it into something bigger. And so that's kind of what my sort of encouragement would be. There are those resources waiting for you. And maybe I'll add one thing. If we think, if the world doesn't blow itself up and we don't, we have 100 ways we could ruin this planet and human life. But if we make it through 100,000 years from now, and if the Christian faith still is a living thing on the earth, then we will look at these first 2,000 years as the very earliest days of church history. I think getting that long view can help us look at things in a different perspective. And whenever I think that way, I think to myself, the practices that we need are just now, maybe some of them are just now being discovered. And there's wonderful, exciting things happening where Christian leaders and Sufi leaders and Jewish mystical leaders and people from Eastern traditions, Dharmic traditions, we're getting together and saying, we're a mess. The human race is a mess. What do you bring to the table? And there's ways that this is happening that Christians are receiving gifts from other traditions to say, we have a little bit of that in our tradition, and you're giving us courage to innovate for how that could be further developed. So that's what I would say, Simon. And the exciting thing is that when you're in a context where nobody's going to jump on you for saying, I'd like to learn, you may be familiar with Father Thomas Keating, who Catholic mystic who just died recently, who introduced, probably millions of people to what he calls centering prayer, which is a bringing together of insights from the Eastern tradition with a deep Christian mystical tradition that involves a kind of prayer that is not filled with words. And all I can say is for so many of us, that's been what helped us go from stage 3 into stage 4. I hope that's helpful.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Simon.
Right. Our next question comes from Stuart Taylor. Stuart, can you start your video and unmute, please?
Hi, Brian.
Hey, Stuart.
Listen, firstly, thank you so much for this book. It's just been fantastic to hear these things said out loud. You find in the words to name, kind of for me, solidify and reassure. I think this is a really brave and important book. So firstly, keep writing, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
My question really is about children and teenagers, not necessarily my own, but perhaps in the context of my church and in my kind of wider family. Perhaps as a parent, as an uncle, as a friend, I find myself in stage 3 and 4, very much kind of what you were saying before made a lot of sense about them kind of recirculating around these different stages. And I find a lot of the children and teenagers who are around me, for me, seem to be just in stage 1. I say just in stage 1, it's an important stage, isn't it? Maybe occasionally in stage 2. My question is perhaps some advice into how can I speak kind of the language of love, if you like, into 1 and 2, but whilst also remain true to my own journey.
Yes.
Yes. So that's.
Oh my goodness, what a great question. And as you know, one of the chapters in the book that I labored on the most was the chapter about rising generations, and that I think one of the things we have to do is create new contexts for kids. And it's interesting, Stuart, obviously this last year with COVID, this hasn't been the case, but over the last probably 3 or 4 years in my travels, the single most common question I get is asked by people like you, parents or educators or grandparents or uncles, who are saying, how do we help children? Because we don't want our children to have to go into a stage 1 box. No. See, where they're given this very rigid simplicity, and they're given the message that this is all there is. See, it's such a small thing to take the box and take the lid off and say, this is the work you have, but to do right now. And there's so much to learn, but this isn't the end. You're going to go from here to somewhere else. And so many of us are struggling with this. And the good news is, I think in 10 years, we'll be at a much better place than we are now. But that doesn't help parents who have a 4-year-old and say, in 10 years, my kid will be 14. I can't wait. I need to help them now. So what I think we need to do is 2 things. I think those of us who are older need to tell honest and authentic stories of our own faith experience. I'm actually just finishing up the sequel to Faith After Doubt that's called Do I Stay Christian? And I am recounting stories in my own upbringing where older people said things that mystified me. They didn't say that, they didn't insult me, they didn't put me down. They just said things that I knew that I didn't know what they were talking about. And what that did is it put this little hole in my thinking to say, there's a lot here that you don't know. And I think there are ways that we, who are adults, can do this for children. I think in Faith After Doubt, I think I told this story of being at a dinner with a kind of famous theologian who I think I was trying very hard to impress. And finally he said to me, Brian, I knew a lot more when I was your age than I know now. And he just let that float out there as his way of giving me this gift of saying, there are things that are going to happen to you that you don't understand. And so I think there are ways that we can do this. There was a great Christian educator here in the US named John Westerhoff, who wrote a book back in the 70s called Will Our Children Have Faith? And he made this bold analysis. He felt that Sunday schools were hurting Christian education. Now, I don't necessarily agree with him in every detail, but it's really interesting critique that he made. He said, in Sunday schools, we put all the 4-year-olds together and all the 8-year-olds together and all the 10-year-olds, and they go through their catechesis or their Christian instruction as an age cohort. He said, but what if one of the most important things an 8-year-old needs is they need to hear 10-year-olds talk about faith in 10-year-old ways, and 12-year-olds talk about faith in 12-year-old ways. And he said, and in a sense, children are only exposed to other children, and they never hear adults talk about their faith. And in fact, adults, many churches, their adults don't have venues where they tell stories about their own faith experiences. And so that got my imagination thinking. And you think about what it would be like for an 8-year-old to hear an adult say, yeah, when I was 20, my mother passed away, and for the next 3 years, I just didn't pray once. I just hated God because my understanding of God was that God took my mother, and I just hated God for doing that. Now, for an 8-year-old to hear a person tell that story is going to say, oh, that's the sort of thing that happens to people. Grown-ups have questions about their faith too. And then maybe she would go on to tell, yeah, I hated God for 3 years, but then I realized that my concept of God, that God, kills people and all the rest, that was, I couldn't believe that anymore. And then that 8-year-old is hearing this story thinking, wow, grown-ups sometimes change their beliefs about God. That's normal, that's accepted, that's part of growing up. That's the kind of thing that I think could really, really make a difference. And sometimes that involves us as adults just having the courage to tell stories about our lives to kids. We risk becoming those boring old people who go blathering on to kids when the kids aren't interested. But it could be that to the degree we're personal, kids will remember that for the rest of their lives. So yeah, such an important question. And maybe I could just add, I'm so glad there's a new generation of Christian educators and parents who are thinking about spiritual development of children. And one really great new book that just came out recently by some friends of mine, it's called The 6 Needs of Every Child. And I'll just tell you, it's on another level from an awful lot of what's been given to parents. I highly, highly recommend that book. And they have a podcast called Growing Connected that really is great too. Yeah. Thanks, Stuart.
Okay, so the next question is also on a similar theme, I think, Brian. So I'd like to invite Nicola Phelan to come and ask that question, please.
My question links to the previous one, really. I just wondered whether adults and children not familiar with the Christian narrative at all, as many are now, actually, if they could be part of an open questioning community from the beginning, would they naturally actually go straight into the later stages, even the harmony one, you know, because they don't have to get rid of a lot of the previous baggage. They don't have to start questioning, really. They're given permission from the beginning to know that there's different ways of looking at those stories. That's my question. Thank you.
What a great question. What a great question, Nicola. Thank you so much. Yes, in fact, this to me is what I think is inevitable. And maybe I could say it like this. If 75 years ago, virtually 100% of parents were in stage 1 themselves, all they can do is raise their children to the level they are. And then their children go off to university and maybe they get introduced to stage 2. And then maybe they, have some other experiences that bring them, but the parents could only bring them to the level they were. But let's say that those children end up in stage 3 and then they have children. And let's say they stay in stage 3. You can pretty much guarantee that if they do a good job raising their children, they'll raise their children to be at stage 3 by the time their children are ready to go off on their own. And I think there's a sense that we could be in a very different situation in 40 or 50 years. If we had more parents who were working from kind of a stage 4 place where they were able to help their children learn the skills of stage 1, but not with not with a lid on the box, not with a low ceiling, but it's always to bring you to the next stage and to the next stage. And what this would mean is parents putting love at the center of their training from the very, very beginning, and helping children understand, yes, I'm teaching you these rules. I want you to learn how to say thank you. I want you to learn how to say please. I want you to say I'm sorry when you do something wrong. Those are the rules. But the rules aren't important in and of themselves. They're important as expressions of love. And then, we go on from there. And I think that could really make a difference. But it would be a revolution in our understanding of parenting and Christian education.
Would that be the same for adults that were just inquiring or exploring faith?
Yes, but the single biggest requirement is that we have more people. Again, I feel bad using these terms, but again, it's a model that we can use and then know it has limitations. But we need more leaders in stage 4 to be able to help people at whatever stage they're in. And if we don't have people creating the communities where stage 4 is kind of is setting the stage, is setting the parameters, is creating the space, I think it will be very hard for us to get there. But Nicola, your question is exactly, it resonates so much with what I think. I think in some ways, we could get to where we need to be faster by working with people without any religious background and helping a new generation of people get a fresh vision of what it means to be Christian in a broad sense of this word. They, in some ways, could get there, and they would have less to unlearn, if I could say it that way. And in that way, working with people with no Christian background could be one of the best ways to help people with a Christian background, because then they would see other people who are getting to a different place. I think that's exactly what was going on in the New Testament. Paul has all of these people who come from his own Jewish background, who have a whole set of assumptions. And he decides, I'm going to start working with Gentiles who don't have any of these assumptions. And I'm not doing it one against the other. I think I'm going to help my fellow Jews the most by working with Gentiles. I think something similar is going on in the New Testament there. Thanks for that great question, Nicola.
Thank you so very much.
Sorry, Nicola. Right, our next question comes from Terry Wilcox.
Thank you so much for your talk tonight. I really enjoyed your illustration of the fellow passenger on your airline flight.
Yeah.
And in reading your book, I feel like I'm chatting to you after the flight's finished, because it was very comforting to look back on, the spiritual journey I've been undertaking, and
Yes.
And see that systematized or categorized in a way that just made sense to me. One of the encouraging things that came out of that, I think, was that the realization that the path has other travelers on it.
Yes.
Because coming from a very solid simplicity sort of denomination, and
Yes.
seeking something a little more, increasingly you are separated from the fellowship and the attachment and belonging, that satisfying that limbic need that you talk about as our brain develops. Our spiritual brain does the same, doesn't it? And we need that. And I think the fact that there are other people on the journey is a great encouragement. However, do you have some advice that will help us identify others in a similar position and enjoying a similar experience, or going through and facing similar challenges? Europe, and the UK in particular, seems to offer little by way of a network of support and acceptance, and so for that reason, I guess I'm still in the closet, in terms of being progressive. And is technology a way forward? I don't want to answer the question for you. I'm just wondering, are there some things we can do? I think Joe earlier in his question talked about a strategic way, which was maybe starting new, I don't know what the right word is, communities. But what about a tactical approach for those individuals who feel, albeit comforted in their journey, somewhat alone?
Yes. So Terry, thanks for asking that question. And maybe better than anything I'm going to say is just thinking that every other person who's on the call or who's on this conversation will feel that. I bet the resonance with other people is very, very great. I hear this everywhere. It's hard to find people. This in some ways shouldn't surprise us. I mentioned that I was a lit major, and in so much literature, there's a kind of literature that's called coming of age literature, and it almost always involves someone leaving home. I even think the story of Adam and Eve leaving the garden is saying, you've got to leave home to learn the lessons you're going to learn. Or the story of Abraham being called from his father's house, everything that's familiar, all the familiar structures. And there's this journey out into the wilderness that involves, that's part of growth and maturity. And so I think that experience of aloneness is, it's super common. It may be absolutely necessary to get to a new place, especially when we don't just think of ourselves as individuals, but we think of ourselves as members of the human community. And so each of us makes these individual breakthroughs that involve solitude, and sometimes they involve rejection and criticism and attack and deep loneliness and wounding even. But as we go on our journey, millions of us individually, we're nudging the world toward a little more maturity maybe. But the strategic question of how we help people find each other and reorganize, it's waiting to be, we need a lot of different solutions. I can tell you what I think is happening now. I think groups like PCN are examples of people saying, we've got to help people find each other so they don't feel alone. But then I'll just tell you, I think the counterpart to Martin Luther's 95 Theses nailed to the wall and the Reformation's use of the printing press today is the podcast. And I just know here in the US and Canada, I mean, I bet there are 50 or more really high quality podcasts of people who are going through this process. And very, very often there are people in stage 3 who basically say, I got to find other people who are asking questions I'm asking. And so they put up a podcast. And then you think thousands of people are driving to work and they're listening to this podcast. And in a sense, they know they're not alone. So I think that's happening in interesting ways already. Websites are doing the same, books are doing the same. But I do think that we're going to have some hard work for churches to come out and not just to be churches that say, we don't believe that stuff anymore, but churches to say, we're about helping people become practitioners of love in the way of Jesus. And we're exploring ways to actually help people do that. And we're developing liturgy that actually helps people do that. It's beginning, but and I think we all know how much it's needed. Maybe just as we managed to come up with COVID vaccine in 1 year rather than 10 years, maybe we'll be able to accelerate this process.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you, Terry. It's a really important question. I hope everybody carries that question with them after this conversation. Okay, Sue will read it for you. Thanks, Christine.
Christine, you've asked 2 questions. So
Yeah.
I'm going to choose one. I'm going to ask the last one. How can we get our preachers to preach what they believe rather than what is expected?
What a great question, Christine. Yeah, I shared that story earlier about when a member of my congregation came and said to me, is this just your journey or is it all of our journey? And I have a feeling that there are some very tender and very human and very humane conversations that can happen within congregations where people go to the pastor and are honest about their questions and doubts and maybe become the people who help liberate their pastor or their priest or their preacher to start to be more honest. So much of our religious world is just the status quo is dishonesty and pretending and hiding, how we really feel or what we really think. So sometimes this just involves one person having the courage and the compassion to go meet with the pastor and say, hey, look, I just want you to know I'm a Christian. I have a lot of doubts. I have a lot of questions. And if you ever need somebody to talk to, I can be that person. I won't judge you. And you never know what can happen from that. I think those very human encounters become, they become breakthroughs. And there may be institutional ways that we can deal with this, but in the short run, I think it's going to take in each location where this is ready to happen, a few courageous people who break their silence. Yeah, thanks, Christine, for that good question.
So I'm going to call on Helen King. Can you start your video and unmute and read your question, Helen?
The question I really wanted to ask is simply, what point do we stay with the institutions that we're in, even though they're crushing us? At what point do we say, actually, no, can't cope with that any longer. I'm moving on. I'm shaking the dust from my feet.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, isn't that a fascinating passage? I think it's in
Yes.
Luke chapter 10, where Jesus says, go into a town, look for people of peace. And if they don't receive you, shake the dust off your feet. In other words, you didn't fail. You didn't do anything wrong. They just weren't ready for you. And don't tell them, God damn you, you bunch of heathens. You say, tell them the kingdom of God has come near to you, even though you don't want to hear about it. It's like, God bless you. I'm moving on. And which is saying not everybody is ready. And our job is to look for the people who are ready. But Helen, I think this is a deeply personal decision. And and I'm glad some people stay in hopeless situations and they actually turn them around. But I'm sad that some people stay in places that just grind them down and crush their souls and waste their time when they could have been somewhere else where they could have been doing so much good. I don't want to mention a name here for the sake of privacy, but there was a pretty well-known evangelical theologian in the United States who was quite a bit older than me, and he was very good to me. He encouraged me. He read my books when I was, a young writer or a younger writer, and he was just very good to me. And he died suddenly, way too soon. And of course, he didn't know this, and I didn't know this, but about a week before he died, he gave me a call out of the blue. And he said to me, Brian, I've spent my life trying to reform evangelicals, he said. And he said, if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't. They're farther away from, they're farther behind now than they were when I started 30 years ago, whatever. And I just felt like he was basically calling me to say, don't keep, that's a bad metaphor, but don't keep beating a dead horse, or don't keep trying where people just don't want to change, I think is what he was saying. And of course, this was long before what's happened here in the US with Trump and all the rest, but he was even seeing then the signs that people were just playing it safe and weren't ready to think new thoughts. But Helen, there's one thing that I could imagine doing. And I wouldn't ever say this as a rule, but it might be useful for some people. And that would be to go to your priest or your pastor or minister and in private and just say, look, I need you to know I'm at a different place. And if you, and let me explain to you what's going on with me. And if you would rather me not be here, I'm willing to go look someplace else. If you really would like me to stay because you think what I'm talking about is something that other people need too, I'll consider staying. But I just need to know, is this something are you glad someone like me is here, or are you not, And that you have to be ready to find out what the answer is. But I'll just tell you, the reason I tell you this is when I was a pastor, we had a lot of gay people in our church, and this is long before gay marriage was legal. So, performing gay weddings became sort of the big, Rubicon you had to cross. So that wasn't even legal. It wasn't even an option, but we had a lot of gay people in our church. But we didn't, we weren't super vocal about, we had a wide variety of opinion about whether same-sex relationships or LGBTQ identity was acceptable or not. And this fellow who had come to our congregation, had come to faith, was a wonderful person. He left the church, and I asked somebody, why did he leave? And he said, because he felt that we weren't moving fast enough on LGBT equality. And I remember thinking, I wish he had come to me and told me that's how he was feeling, because I was uncomfortable with how slow we were going too. And if he had come to me, we could have worked together, to help move things along faster. So that's why I say I think there's some value. Maybe I'll say it in the terms of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. I'm going to guess that the priest or minister, pastor, or whatever, it would be doing a nice thing for them, to give them to let them know where you really are and not just quietly disappear. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you, Helen. Now, the next question is from Roger Whiteley.
Say, Brian, one of the things that I find really difficult when preaching is the variety of ways in which people seek to define what we mean by God.
Yes.
Well, over to you.
Yes. So thanks for bringing that up, Roger. Yes. This is a huge problem. You are so right. And as a preacher, you understand, you say the word God, and if you have 100 people in the congregation, if there was a little thought bubble above their head, there are probably 100 different ideas. And some of the ideas are diametrically opposed. And it's why a lot of people are just struggling to even use the word anymore, because they feel the word has definitions to it that they in good conscience just can't use, And I just think one of our big challenges is to just feel the weight of that. And it's not just the word God, it's where God shows up in our hymns and in our creeds and in our prayers, and the assumptions that are behind how the word God is used, that I think are more and more problematic for more and more people. And, Roger, if I could call a convocation of creative and deeply spiritual and deeply knowledgeable people from around the world, this is the convocation I would call, to say, let's get together to have a global summit on what we're going to do with the word God. It can be a kind of Trojan horse very easily that brings in things that are really, really destructive. And so here's what I think is happening, and here's what I think will happen. I think that right now we're surviving through ambiguity. Yes. In other words, we're allowing people to have these completely irreconcilable understandings, and we're just trying to hope that they don't notice. But I think what's going to have to happen is people like you and me are going to have to start becoming more clear. Not that we're trying to define God in a way that everybody now has to conform to, but that we're at least clear that when we say the word, we have many different ideas. And I think there's ways that preachers like you and me can do this, where we say, for example, when I was, to recall Paul's question earlier, when I was 20 years old and I said the word God, I had a set of ideas and images in my mind. And now at 65, when I say the word God, those ideas and concepts and images are very, very different. And I'm going to guess that that's happening with you too. In other words, we normalize and we make clear that this is something that happens and that this isn't a bad thing. Then we might even help people understand that in the Bible, different biblical writers, when they said the word God, it's very clear they had very different ideas in their mind too. And then that we say that in the Bible, there are rip-roaring arguments about what God was like and what people meant with God when they said God. So that would be one whole set of clarity that I just think it wouldn't resolve the problem, but it would at least get us out of ambiguity and help us, in a sense, understand that this is the fix we're in. I think over the next 50, 75, 100 years, I think there's going to be a powerful breakthrough. I think we're going to work this out in some better ways, but in some places. But I think in the short run, that's a creative project that we just haven't that we just haven't resolved yet. And I think, I forgot, I think it was Simon who asked the question about spiritual practices. I wonder if part of the way this is going to work out is that if we work from a 4-stage framework, if we aren't stuck with a stage 1 framework, we will be able to say to people, if you're going to use, and we might say, some folks here use the word God and some folks don't, and we understand why. But if you're going to use the word God, we ask that you start from your own experience. And that we ask that you really try to be honest to your own experience. And we might even suggest to people that based on the teaching of Jesus and based on the life of Jesus and based on the great saints and sages through history, we start by saying, whatever God is experienced through love of neighbor, and that includes stranger and outsider and outcast and enemy. God is experienced through love of self, because the love with which we love ourselves needs to be divine love. Love, and God is experienced through love of this earth, love of a bird, love of a tree, love of the ocean, love of the ecosystem, love of science, love of the mystery of the universe. And that whatever we mean by God, we mean something that we've come to know through the experience of love. If that were to happen, it might then allow us to use the word without so much trouble. But I don't see any shortcut to get there. I don't know. I thank you for raising that question, Roger. It's really a big one. And I think those of us who preach really feel it, don't we?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And so I think we'll go to Neil Perry, actually. So Neil, if you'd like to start your video, unmute and ask your question, please.
Hello.
Hi, Neil.
My question, well, first a bit of context. For me, I'm deep into stage 3.
Yes.
Have been for a number of years, but only really started recently exploring things. My journey was started really by a number of painful events. You insinuated that you've been through something similar, rather than driven by the cognitive dissonance of trying to balance faith and reason. So most of the material I've found on my journey has been about balancing faith and reason. And there's nothing wrong with that. I've just finished an excellent course called a Galilee course by Reverend Tim Yeager, who's a countryman of yours, but over here in the UK. But I'm aware of a need in myself to have some sort of pastoral view of the journey as well. I dare say, from what you've described of your book, it seems to be mainly about the faith and reason thing. Maybe I'm wrong, so I haven't read it. But what would you recommend, both to the church in terms of people who are dealing with doubt because of pain, and to those on the journey because of pain? Well, how would you fill in the gaps there?
Yes. Well, first of all, Neil, thanks for this question. And maybe if it would be okay, let's make this the last question, because it's when we bring up the subject of pain, it's hard to move on. And if I could take a little more time with this question, I think it would be a good one to end with. And Neil, I hope if you do read the book, no pressure, you're in the company of over 7 billion people who haven't read it, so don't worry. But if you do read it, I think you'll find it's not just about faith and reason issues, but I think this issue of pain and disappointment and emptiness and grief and loss and trauma and all of the rest, I think this is actually far, far more important than just the faith and reason discussion, as important as that is. I think it's deeply, deeply important. And I just want to tell you an example of this. Many of you might know I teach with the Center for Action and Contemplation, started by Father Richard Rohr, Franciscan. And one of our faculty is a fellow named Jim Finley, who was studying to be a priest. And when he was a seminarian, he was a student of Thomas Merton. He ended up leaving and became a teacher and a therapist, and is just an amazing human being. But Jim is very open about the fact that he grew up with a violently abusive father. And Jim's experience of a violent, horrible, hateful, vicious father is what made him want to go to the seminary. It's part of what attracted him to Thomas Merton. It's what made him go on a kind of spiritual search. But he has integrated that trauma with all of his theology. And I'll just tell you, he is one of the deepest and most thoughtful human beings I've ever met, and certainly one of the deepest Christian teachers I've ever met. You can hear a lot of his talks online if you're interested, but the reason I'm bringing him up is I heard him say something once that it made some people really angry because they asked questions later. He said, in my experience, God is with us in everything and protects us from nothing. And a woman raised her hand and she said, but there are so many Bible verses that talk about God protecting us, and we're always praying. If what you're saying is true, 90% of my prayers are wasted, because if you're saying that God protects us from nothing. And Jim just let that sink in for a minute. And he said, I understand that what I just said disturbs you. He said, but I know that there's a 14-year-old boy or a 14-year-old girl in this town. If I were to say that God protects you, I know that they're praying every single day that their father would stop beating them or their mother would stop abusing them. And it doesn't stop. And he said, so I have to choose to upset and disturb you than to rub salt in their wounds. He said, it's because I am a child of abuse. And by the way, it didn't just stop when he grew up, because he tells the story of his last encounter on his father's deathbed. His father was still insulting him and attacking him, with his last breath. So he experienced his father's hatred through his whole life. But he said, so I have to just tell you from my experience, the God I have come to love is very different from that God who protects people. And my experience of God is the presence that is with me in my suffering. And I just tell that story, Neil, because I think so much of our theology is intended to comfort people and help them not be afraid, which is very, very understandable, but it ends up making false promises that end up rubbing salt in the wounds of people in pain. Mm. And as we move forward, I think that's one of the areas where I think doubt becomes important, not just to help us as individuals cope with our own questions and pain, but so that we stop rubbing salt in the wounds of people who are already in pain with easy answers that are intended to bring comfort, but we have no idea of the harm that they're doing. And yeah, there's so much more that we could say, but I want to thank you for bringing that to the fore, because this is, I think, so important for us as we move forward. Maybe I can just close with a story that brings to mind. When I was a pastor, we bought some land and built a church building. And I'd been told that the next door neighbor, the guy who owned the property next door, had been very nice to us. We didn't have a hose long enough to water the bushes that we planted along the border of his lawn, and that he had watered those bushes for us for a year, and they were thriving and doing great. And I'd never even seen him, I'd never met him. So one day I saw him out watering bushes, and I ran over and I said, "Hi, you're Louis, right?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "I've heard about how kind you've been to us watering these bushes." And so Louis and I began to chat. And Louis said to me, "I've been meaning to ask you a question. I've never come to your church. I really have no interest in church." He said, "I'm a secular Jew myself." He said, "But I have one question." He said, "I have a son." And I should say, Louis was Irish. He was an Irish Jew who had emigrated to the US. He says, "I have a son who went back to Israel and served in the Israeli army, the IDF, Israeli Defense Force. And once he was manning a checkpoint, and where Palestinians would go through. And he was watching some of his fellow soldiers taunt a Palestinian fellow and humiliate him. He said they pulled down his pants and said they were going to circumcise him just as a way to humiliate him. And he said, my son pulled out his gun and held it on his fellow soldiers and told them to stop and told the Palestinian fellow to leave. My son went to jail and spent, I forget, 18 months in jail for what he did. He said, I only have one question for you, sir. He said, do you think my son is in hell because he's a Jew? Or will go to hell because he's a Jew? And I said, Louis, no, I don't believe that at all. And I think your son is an amazing person to stand up for someone. I said, you know, I know you're a Jew. I know I'm a Christian, but Jesus was a Jew. And Jesus was somebody who believed in standing up for people who were being humiliated and harmed, you know. So I'm with your son and I have great respect for your son. And he said, that's all I need to know. He says, I'm glad I've watered your bushes. But I just remember in that conversation, I thought, again, here's how theology can do so much harm. And part of our work, I think, in moving into stage 4 is to start with compassion rather than starting with ideas. So thank you. And I think your question brings us to that place, to me, that is very much the direction that I think we all need to go. So thank you. And thanks to everybody for all the great questions. And I'm sorry, I must have been too long-winded. We didn't get to all of them, but they were such good questions, and it's been such a great chance to be with you all. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, it falls to me now, Brian, to give what we've described as a vote of thanks, which sounds terribly British and formal after your brilliant exposition this evening. So where to start? I suppose I should start by reminding everybody that this event tonight has been brought to you by PCN Britain. PCN is the largest progressive Christian network membership organisation in the UK, and it has an influence because of its membership. It has a voice because of its membership. So John Spong, who was one of the early inspirations on PCN, once said that church is a bit like a swimming pool in that most of the noise comes from the shallow end. So in order to get a bit more noise from perhaps a little further towards the deep end, it's great if as many people as possible would consider joining PCN. In terms of individuals, though, I'd like to just extend our thanks particularly to Sarah Guilfoyle and Paul Onslow for their particular work putting this together. And we're also grateful to the good people at Hodder, Brian, for publishing your work, and all the other people who've published your work through the years. Of course, our main thanks goes to you. You really do represent a sort of a wise elder figure in the progressive Christian community, which is, you know, something that we're all very grateful for. I think earlier on you said that you know, when you started thinking about things, you hardly knew a single person who was asking the questions that you were asking. And I think we've all probably experienced that, and I know I have. And I was so pleased when I found your work, you know, a number of years ago now, because you were the person that was asking the questions that I was asking. And that has meant so much to me and so many of us over the last decades. So thank you very, very much for that. And on that note then, we've come to the end of our meeting tonight. So it remains for me to say, go in peace, friends, and thank you all very much for being part of this.